500 by Senator Steinberg has been pulled from today's agenda, so I'm going to be the only one presenting a bill today. Now, immediately after that, if there are, depending upon the vote on that bill, we'll either adjourn the regular hearing and then move to the informational hearing on the Bay Bridge, which is the joint hearing, or we'll recess transportation and housing if we don't have the sufficient votes, and we'll reopen the hearing after that. Since all of you are here, it won't impact anybody who is here right now. So with that, we're going to begin, and will the Secretary please call the roll for the regular hearing, the first hearing for transportation and housing today.
Lowenthal.
Here.
Huff.
Here.
Ashburn.
Present.
DeSaulnier. Harmon. Kehoe. Oropeza. Pavley. Here. Simitian.
Good. I want to thank all the committee members that are here. We do have a quorum. Welcome back. I hope this is going to be a great year. And let me make a presentation of SB 454, and I'll turn that over to Senator Huff, the Vice Chair.
Please go ahead and make your presentation, Senator.
Is this on? Okay, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Members, SB 454 has to do with housing preservation, and as we know, over the past 4 decades, nonprofit and for-profit developers have built over 450,000 or 425,000 units of affordable housing in California. These developers received public subsidies in exchange for agreeing to maintain the affordability of the units for some period of time, either 35 years or sometime, to some extent, 50 years. And for that, they received a subsidy to do that. When these time periods expire, the owners are eligible to convert these developments to market-rate apartments. Given the ongoing shortage of affordable housing in California and the fact that it is much cheaper to keep existing housing than to construct new housing, we try to preserve as much affordability of such housing where we can. In an arrangement worked out over the years with property owners, current law facilitates preservation by requiring owners to give tenants and governmental entities notice of a potential conversion 1 year prior to converting. So they have to provide us with that information and also to the tenants for 1 year. This 1 year period conforms with and is coordinated with similar federal law. So we're being consistent now with federal law. During this 1 year period, current law also provides preservation purchasers, those committed to maintaining affordability, with limited priority to purchase the property if, and I require, if the owner is inclined to sell. That's all, if they are inclined to sell. During the first 6 months, the owner is not required to accept any offer to sell, but may only accept offers from preservation purchasers during that first. This is existing law. If the owner rejects a purchase offer during this period, the owner must give the preservation purchaser who made the offer an opportunity to match and preempt any offer from a non-preservation purchaser which is accepted during that second 6 months. So they're given an opportunity, but they don't have it. The law does not obligate the owner to sell, and it maintains the owner's right to convert the units to market-rate rentals or sell with no strings attached once that 1 year notice is completed. That is existing law. In light of the fact that development will be eligible for conversion into the future, we're going to see a number of these to be converted into the future, and that there simply has been no controversy surrounding this law, SB 454 simply eliminates the 2010 sunset date. That's all it does. This law facilitates the preservation of existing affordable housing while striking what I believe is the appropriate balance between the property rights of owners and the obligations imposed in exchange for receiving a public subsidy, because they receive a great deal in terms of building these houses. In light of this partnership, owners are asked to give some priority for preservation, but ultimately the owner has the ability to do what she or he chooses once this 1 year of notice has lapsed, or he or she, or that they have exited from the program. The California California Association of Realtors said they're fine with this bill, and the Apartment Association does not yet have an official position, but does not, in conversations with us, does not expect to have any concerns at all with this bill. I urge your aye vote, and I have here witnesses in support.
Good afternoon, Brian Augusta with the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation. Our office and the California Coalition for Rural Housing are sponsoring this bill because the law has been such a success. It's a win-win. Every day in this state, we put people to work building affordable housing. And as soon as that young family moves into that new unit and signs the lease, that family in need, just down the street or across town, we risk losing an existing affordable unit and risk really not making any progress if that unit comes offline and is no longer an affordable unit. This law gives the opportunity to bring willing buyer and willing seller together to preserve the affordability of the units and make sure that we continue, as we build new units, to also not lose ground and lose some of the affordable units that we've already built. It's a win-win, and we think the law has worked. As the senator says, very little controversy around the law. We should remove the sunset and preserve the units that are at risk of coming offline in the next 5 years, of like 80,000 units. So for all those reasons, we would urge an aye vote.
Thank you. Next witness.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Sparks, and I'm Vice President for Mercy Housing California. We're a nonprofit housing development concern here in California. And I wanted to emphasize that having an advance notice positions us to be able to go out and develop the financing plan necessary to meet the asking price of these sellers of property that are wanting to liquidate their interest in affordable housing. It is our interest to preserve that housing in perpetuity. As was alluded to earlier, while we are building new housing stock, we seem to be losing ground when units like this are lost to the affordable housing inventory. Thank you.
Next witness.
Say your name and support.
My name is Randy Quesada with the California Housing Partnership. We strongly support an aye vote on this bill as well. We believe that this is one of the most effective tools that we have in preserving the stock of affordable housing. As the Senator mentioned, preserving housing is a lot more cost effective than building new housing. And every time we lose an existing unit of affordable housing, it's a backslide. It's a step in the wrong direction. And we strongly believe that this bill will go a long way in preserving the long-term viability for the state's lower-income families to be able to stay here. Thank you.
Next witness. Anyone else? Any witnesses opposed? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the members for any questions, comments. Senator Simitian, you're very quiet over there. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. All right, we have a motion. Would you care to close?
I just urge your aye vote.
Okay, please call the roll.
Lowenthal.
Aye.
Lowenthal, aye. Huff.
Aye.
Huff, aye. Ashburn. Ashburn, aye. DeSaulnier. Harmon. Kehoe. Oropeza. Oropeza, aye. Pavley. Pavley, aye. Simitian. Simitian, aye. 6-0.
Okay, that's out. Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses. And, you want to keep the roll call open then?
I think what we're going to do is to adjourn this, and we'll close with 6 votes. The vote is
Current vote 6-0. Kehoe, aye. 7-0.
That bill passes. The vote is 7-0. No, we haven't yet adjourned the Lowenthal bill. 7-0. Aye.
DeSaulnier, aye. Current vote, 8-0.
Trickling in. Vote is 8-0. This bill passes. The Senate Transportation and Housing Regular Committee, our first committee hearing, is now officially adjourned. Okay, we are now going to move towards our joint legislative informational hearing between Senate Transportation and Housing, the Senate Select Committee on Bay Area Transportation, the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Subcommittee number 2 on Resources, Environment, and Transportation. I am the chair of Housing and Transportation. Senator Leno is the chair of the Select Committee on Bay Area Transportation. Senator Simitian is the chair of the Budget Subcommittee, too. And we are also joining us will be the Assembly Transportation Committee. Assembly Member Eng is also here as the chair. I'm going to make an opening statement, if I can find one. And then ask the other 3 chairs. We have more chairs than members today, so this is a very interesting day. So, and vice chairs too. So we're just full of chairs and vice chairs in the room, and we also have Senator Ashburn with us. Right. Who is it? We're not going there. Yeah, we're going to talk about the bridge, Bay Bridge, right now. Last Labor Day, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge was closed so construction workers could remove a 300-foot-long, 3,200-ton double-deck section of the east span and roll in a new double-deck section. This was done to facilitate the construction of the east span of the Bay Bridge. During that closure, while this was taking place, Caltrans inspected the bridge and found that an I-bar was cracked. Caltrans then made emergency repairs, and the bridge reopening was delayed by only 2 hours. A few weeks later, 5,000 pounds of steel fell to the bridge deck at rush hour when the temporary fix failed. Fortunately, and I stress that, fortunately for all of us, no lives were lost. The bridge was closed for 6 days while Caltrans reconfigured and reinstalled a temporary fix. During the redesign of the safety apparatus, Caltrans consulted extensively with university engineers and federal officials. During the following 7 weeks, a permanent repair was designed, with the assistance of a peer review committee, and installed without having to close the bridge. You know, we all owe Caltrans a debt of gratitude for its efforts to repair the Bay Bridge, and I hope that Mr. Iwasaki will tell us what he believes some of the lessons that were learned from the series of incidents on the bridge, and that he can assure the public that during the remaining 5 years that this older section of the bridge will remain in operation until the construction is completed for the new bridge opening, the next 5 years, 4 to 5 years, that this type of an event will not happen again. As required by federal law, Caltrans must inspect all bridges in the state, its own bridges, as well as local bridges, every 2 years or as often as warranted. I really look forward to, in today's hearing, to hearing from the director of Caltrans explaining to us how Caltrans will be adequately able to inspect the 24,000 bridges that make up the California's bridge inventory every 2 years in light of furloughs and the department's budgetary constraints. I welcome Mr. Iwasaki, my legislative colleagues, and who are here today, the audience members to this joint hearing, And I ask now my colleagues, especially who are also co-chairing this event, to really introduce this and make some remarks. I would like to first start with my Assembly Transportation Committee colleague, Chair, Assembly Member Eng. Welcome, and thank you for co-hosting this.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Lowenthal and members, for inviting the Assembly Transportation Committee to join our erstwhile colleagues in a very, very important hearing. Joining me, I want to make note of the Assembly Transportation Vice Chair, Mr. Jeffries, and also a member of the Assembly Transportation Committee, Mr. Nilo, joining us today. I have to admit that based on the first accounts of the fracture of the Bay Bridge due to age, which I have gotten a tour of, I was very, very worried. While the Bay Bridge may be the most heavily traveled bridge in the state, it is far from the oldest. And my initial thought was that if this bridge is failing because it's old, what about all the others? And at my age, I do worry about old age. Plus, the less than stellar history of the I-bar construction that became a collective worry of the state of California. I have to say that, however, my staff has made numerous inquiries with the Caltrans engineers regarding the original I-bar fracture, and as a result, my worries have subsided. Nevertheless, I look forward to hearing from Director Iwasaki and his staff this afternoon, and I thank you for including the Assembly Transportation Committee in this afternoon's hearing to do the due diligence that's required of our committees. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members.
Thank you, Assemblymember Eng. Now I'd like to ask Senator Simitian, who is chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Subcommittee Number 2 on Resources, Environment, and Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that our hearing today is relatively narrow in its focus, but I do think it's important both for Caltrans and for folks who are not here from other agencies who play a role, and I'm thinking of MTC particularly, as well as the Bay Area Toll Authority, to place this in the larger context, because this particular incident comes on the heels of a longer discussion. I recall being in this very room 5 years ago, I believe it was now, for hearings about the Bay Bridge that members of the committee took part in and that folks from Caltrans were part in. And so while I don't expect us to get into this today, I do think it's important as we have this conversation about this particular incident and what it does or doesn't mean to sort of reference the previous conversations we've had. This is not the first conversation. We're talking about a bridge that failed in an earthquake more than 20 years ago now. The final completion date for a replacement structure and demolition of the old bridge will mean it has taken us a quarter of a century to respond to that incident. I think that ought to be cause for concern. We talked in the hearing we had in this very room in 2005 about the multi-billion-dollar cost overruns and about the delays year after year after year in moving this project forward. I do not lay all of that on Caltrans. I want to be very clear about that. But again, it needs to be part of the larger conversation or the context in which we talk about this most recent episode. Meanwhile, we've asked commuters to pay increasingly high tolls. As recently as 5-6 years ago, the toll was $2. Today it's $4. We're told it's about to go up to $6 for commuters who travel during peak commute times, which is, after all, when most people need to get to work or come home from work. On top of that, we've got a fast-track system that Caltrans and the MTC continue to try and push people into, and one of the ways they push people into that system is by making it increasingly difficult to simply shell out your $4 and get across the bridge. Then with all of that going on, we've got a repair which then not only closed the bridge but subsequently failed and caused further closure. Apart from the life safety issues, which I think are considerable, and create a measure of anxiety among the driving public, that raises, I think, a set of questions which still have not been answered about where did the process fail us. When there is a repair, you have to design the repair, you have to construct the repair, you have to implement the repair, and then you have to review the repair you've done. I heard earlier the chairman reference a peer review process. If this process was peer reviewed, then why didn't we find the failure in either the design, the fabrication, the placement, or the testing and review that took place after the placement of the repair had been done. I have been told by Caltrans that there was wind and vibration. Yes, on that bridge, in that location, wind and vibration, it seems to me, should not have been a surprise to the folks who designed, fabricated, installed, and reviewed the fix. So the question I would like to hear some response to today is, where did we go wrong so that we don't go wrong yet again, and so that people can feel comfortable that we have learned our lessons from this incident and that those lessons will be put to good use in the future. Having said that, I want to close on a more positive note. There are an extraordinarily large number of good people who do good work at Caltrans every day. So I think it's important as we have this conversation today that however critical I may be or any other member of the committee may be, we not overlook the fact that there are an extraordinary large number of people who do good work at Caltrans every day. The second is, it is no small task. The undertaking that is currently underway is an extraordinarily complex one. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where there has to be zero tolerance when it comes to failure. And finally, all of this, I think, also begs the question about the S-curve, which I think we ought to have some conversation about today, Mr. Chairman, because to have the rate of accidents we have in the immediate aftermath of the S-curve suggests that we were not as well prepared for the implementation of that fix as we should have been as a state. Those are my views, and I hope that Caltrans will respond to the issues that I've raised during the course of my comments.
Thank you, Senator Simitian. And now I'd like to call up on Senator Mark Leno, who is chair of the Senate Select Committee on Bay Area Transportation, to say a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal and Chair Simitian, for allowing me to join each of you as chairs of your committees as the chair of the Select Committee on Bay Area Transportation. The Bay Bridge certainly being a significant component of Bay Area transportation. I won't repeat all of the many astute comments of my colleague, Senator Simitian, in reviewing the situation here, but I just want to underscore that in addition to the concerns for safety, which have to be paramount, any further closures of the bridge would be unacceptably disruptive to San Francisco, which is of concern to me. I don't think we even have a price tag on the tens of millions, it could have been even more, of dollars lost to small and large businesses in San Francisco that week that the bridge was closed. It was closed for obvious and necessary reasons, but we cannot repeat this, and we have to best understand how it all occurred so that that will not come to pass again. I know that the design of the committee hearing has been somewhat limited to the construction of bridges with I-bars, given that that's where the failure was and is the focus of the hearing. But not only do we need to address the S-curve, but also the greater scheme of the bridge rebuild of the eastern span. There was a significant story in the San Francisco Chronicle just last week cheering the success of the fact that a year delayed, the fabricated steel has now left China and is on its way to San Francisco for installation. I want to better understand how it is that the decision was made to have the steel not only manufactured but also fabricated in China. How many jobs were lost here in the United States as a result? Might we even review this 25% requirement with regard to differentiation in price when decisions are made to either buy American or foreign? And what loss of oversight do we experience when we're not in the position to be fabricating? And how can we reinstill greater confidence by those hundreds of thousands of drivers who use the Bay Bridge on a regular basis? So there's a lot here to discuss. I don't know that we'll get all to it today, but maybe this is the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you. Are there any other members that wish to say something, initial statement? Yes, Mr. Jeff.
I'd just like to briefly point out that the director did present much of this to the Budget Sub-5 committee over on the Assembly side. Caltrans is definitely feeling the effects of this and the challenges that are associated with it. And I think the director has inherited a lot of challenges with a large agency and I'm certainly hopeful that under his leadership, we're going to see some significant changes and improvements, and look forward to that. Thank you.
Well, here we begin, and our star witness on the status of the Bay Bridge safety and related bridge issues, and we've already have a number of those issues that have been identified and that we'd like Randy Iwasaki, Director of Caltrans, to please address. And so welcome to the committee. Again, we're not interested in pointing fingers. We're not. Mr. Niello is interested in pointing fingers, but the rest of us he's a professional finger pointer, are not interested in pointing fingers. But we are interested in finding out and understanding what took place and how this, and the opportunity that we have here to ask other questions that we've already heard, either pertaining to the delay or other issues about the design that I'm sure that will come up during this hearing. So with that, it's a pleasure to see you.
Nice to see you.
Mr. Director.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lowenthal, Simidian, Leno.
And I'm glad you have a flak jacket there that you're wearing.
I brought an extra flak jacket, thanks. And members of the committees, thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you about the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge.
Can you speak closer to the microphone, please?
I have brought with me today Richard Harmon, the Legend Deputy, Tony Anziano, who's the Toll Bridge Program Manager, and then Barton Newton, who's the State Bridge Maintenance Engineer. And so as we move forward and when we get questions, if I need help, they'll provide their technical experts in their various fields. So as you are all aware, we are making history in the Bay Area with the construction of the east span of the Bay Bridge. The completed span, which is taking place in the Bay, is truly going to be a significant and a signature bridge for California. Until the bridge is completed, however, we are continuing to work to keep the existing bridge in safe operation. This is a huge task unto itself. The bridge is more than 73 years old and carries more than 250,000 cars or vehicles a day. We at Caltrans take immense pride in our inspection program and staff. We have some of the finest engineers in the United States, if not the world, as well as in the maintenance, operation, and construction staff who keep this lifeline structure in service. I would also like to thank Senators Simidian and Leno and committee staff for taking time during your busy schedules for visiting us last week and spending some time on the bridges. It was cold that day, but I think it was well worth the visit. Hopefully the tour provided some perspective on the magnitude and scope of the work being performed, and it was a pleasure for me to take all of you out there. Again, thank you for the invitation. I look forward to sharing information and answering any questions that you may have. And I'll go right into a chronology, and please stop me when I get to a point where you want to ask a question. As was mentioned before by Senator Lowenthal, on September the 3rd was a day that we began closing the bridge to roll out a 3,200-ton section of old structure, and the idea over the next 4 days was to roll a 3,700-ton detour segment into place. I know that day very well because it was my 50th birthday. And so at 8 o'clock, we began closing. Normally, when we first started this effort in closing the Bay Bridge, which takes a lot of coordination with not only the California Highway Patrol, but also with local PD, it took us a couple hours to get that structure closed. That day, we did it in 21 minutes. And so we had the bridge isolated, and we began work. And so on September the 5th, our inspectors, so every 2 years we inspect the Bay Bridge. That's our biannual bridge inspection program for that structure. The last time we had it closed was 2 years earlier on Labor Day, and we did the bridge inspection then. We didn't find an I-bar issue at that time. And so on September the 5th, during our 2-year program, we found a crack in an I-bar. And so they called me immediately and said we found a crack in the I-bar. And I thought, wow, that's pretty miraculous, and that they must be looking over every square inch, which they do, of the structure. But to catch that's incredible. And so I said, take me out to the location of the crack, because I was thinking in terms of welding crack, which is very, very small. And as I stood on the bridge deck, I said, where's the crack? They said, it's right up there. And it was 120 feet in the air. You could see the crack as plain as day. And so that is an issue. And what I said then is that if the bridge hadn't been closed for the roll out and roll in of the detour segment, that we would have made the necessary adjustments and analyzed it very quickly and more than likely shut that bridge down with no notification whatsoever. But in this case, the bridge was already closed for other work, and so our engineers began to design what I'll call as a fix. It's an external jacking system that was designed using readily available materials that we could get very quickly, assemble in the field, and with some field mock-ups and testing, we could get that assembly in place very quickly. And so our engineers designed that, and it wasn't just our engineers, but it was also engineers from T.Y. Lin, the designer of record for the replacement span of the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge, the East Span. And also the contractor has engineers on staff that took a look at the design as well, because we have to make sure that the contractor can build whatever is being designed. And so that review took place. The fabrication was ordered, the parts were ordered from a steel company, Stinger Steel, MacArthur Mays, the same manufacturer or fabricator that fabricated the girders for that repair, actually fabricated the saddles, and then the outriggers. We bought the high-speed or high-strength tie rods from Avar. They're in the Bay Area?
Yes.
They're in the Bay Area, Fremont. And we manufactured bearing plates and the outriggers. And we began assembly. We hired C.C. Myers, who was on site for the rollout and roll-in of the detour section. And they went to work. And as was mentioned by Senator Lowenthal, the delay was around 2 hours. The night before I did address the media, it wasn't looking very good. There were some issues associated with spacing, and the contractor was not giving us positive signs for an opening on time at 5 a.m. on Tuesday. And so rather than to rush the fabrication and the fit-up and the ultimate assembly, I went to the media and announced to the traveling public and all of you that we were not going to open it at 5 a.m. on Tuesday, but we're going to open it at 5 a.m. on Wednesday. That was the current schedule. Everything went right during that fabrication. Ultimately, the delay was about 2 hours in opening the structure. And then what we did is, on a weekly basis, began inspecting the fix. And so what happened during some wind events previous to the ultimate failure of the fix, our inspectors on a weekly basis that notified took a look at the fix, they noticed that the rods were vibrating. They're very long bars. They're about 100 feet long, and the harmonics, it must have been the natural harmonics of the wind moving the bars, but they noticed the structure was moving. And I also want to make it clear that this I-bar chain and the bridge moves. So when you stand on the bridge, you can feel the bridge moving, and it moves side to side. And so it's flexible in nature. The I-bar system is basically bars set together, connected with a pin, and it's designed to rotate like this. But in this location, there's 16 locations like this. The bars actually rotate like this as the bridge moves up and down, but they also move because they're so long like this because they're not laterally supported. And so our engineers took a look at that. They were concerned about the movement of those tie rods, those high-strength tie rods. And they went back and they began talking to Barton and others about how do we quiet those tie rods down. Ultimately, a few days later, this is a couple months after we first installed the fix?
Right.
A couple of months after we first installed the fix. And the fix was never designed. One of the questions was, why didn't we know that this was going to happen? The fix was not designed to fail, in that the high-strength tie rods were stressed only to half of their capacity, or less than half of their capacity. And so what happened is, apparently during the wind event and during the motions, the bar moves around in the hole that was drilled, and it became embedded against metal. And once it's stuck there, what happened is it becomes like a paper clip. As you vibrate a paper clip back and forth with one end fixed, it becomes brittle at end, ultimately is sheared. It was in tension. Once the tension was released and the other part of the saddle, the tension was not released, the outrigger rotated counterclockwise, broke the welds, and then came crashing down the bridge deck.
Through the chair. Senator Lowenthal?
Yes.
Could I interrupt with a question at this point? Thank you.
Any member wishes to ask questions?
So I want to go back, and if you think I've misframed the question, please feel free to say so. But it seems to me that somebody looked at the problem after it was identified, designed a fix, fabricated a fix, installed the fix, and reviewed the work. Is that a fair characterization of what happens when you see there's a problem and then you go fix it? So my question is, that ended up not working out for reasons you described. It sounds to me like you're saying that given the circumstances that exist on the bridge, that it was not properly designed given the wind and vibration that the bridge was going to experience, that the problem was not in the fabrication or the installation or the review of the work once it was done. Do I have that right? If we had it to do all over again and we're going to avoid this problem, would the problem have been avoided with a different design? Is that where things went wrong? That's what I'm trying to determine.
Hopefully I answered your question, but maybe just a little bit a different way. Ultimately, when it crashed down, I asked, the chief engineer, Rick Land, called me and said, we have a problem, and we're going to go and put that fix back in place. I said, I want an external peer review this time. I want external people not involved in the original fix. I don't want people that are involved in the situation of rolling the bridge out and rolling it in. I want external people with expertise in structural steel and structural mechanics. And so they called a professor from UC San Diego and a professor from UNR. And they came in and took a look at the fix. And so the best way to answer that is what they recommended was they liked the idea of the saddle and outriggers and high-strength rods, but it needed to be bolstered a little bit in that the hole needed to be bigger. Instead of a flat nut, they needed a conical shaped nut so that because the bar is going to move anyway, it goes around the circle instead of embedding up against one area, and then put wind dampeners on the bars to tie them together to quiet those bars down, which we were doing anyway. The conical shaped nut and those ideas we got from an external review. And we were also asked to take a look at that not on a weekly basis, but on a daily basis to ensure the geometry of the fix was correct. So that's the way to answer you is the fix is still the fix with some minor modifications to ensure no metal-on-metal contact.
Let me tell you what I think I just heard, or at least how I would characterize it, which is that the original design was somewhat inadequate to the task. Conceptually, maybe close, but not good enough to avoid what ultimately was a failure. That whoever was handed the original design built it the way they were told to build it, that it was installed the way people were told to install it, and that when it was reviewed, which presumably somebody did once it was installed, that somebody said, yep, looks good to me. Another way to come at this is if you had to do this on the next failure that was identical, what would you do differently? And what I heard you say is we'd use the same general approach, but we'd design it slightly differently based on the input we got from the external peer review. So, all right, so that tells me where things went wrong, or at least I think it does. I thought I heard the chairman say earlier that there was peer review in the initial fix, not just the external peer review that came after. Did I hear that incorrectly? Was there peer review of some kind as this process of designing, fabricating, installing, and reviewing the initial work was done? Was there some kind of peer review process?
There were many reviews of this ultimate design that went on the bridge first called the fix. It was not only reviewed by the engineers that were on scene, but it was also being reviewed by Barton's folks back in Sacramento. But also T.Y. Lin, the engineer of record, which is a consulting firm, took a look at it, as well as the engineers that every erector of steel has on staff. And so it was not just our engineers, but our engineers are the designer of record, in this case on the fix, but it was looked at from more of an internal view, our consultant, our contractor.
How old is the bridge now again?
73
okay.
years.
So good news, bad news. The good news is that you feel like you can tell all of us that inadequate or ultimately unsuccessful design was the best people could come up with based on pretty wide-ranging review from the best professionals in the field. That being said, it failed. Now, it could fail because of sort of extraordinary circumstances that no one could possibly be expected to anticipate, or it could fail due to circumstances that should have been and could have been anticipated, but weren't, which would be a cause for concern. The comments that we've heard from Caltrans in the aftermath of the incident was focused on wind and vibration. We have a 73-year history with this bridge. How is it that all of the best expertise you brought to bear didn't anticipate the impact of the wind and the vibration when the original design was being anticipated?
I think that whenever bridges are designed, one of the main factors that when you look at the design is wind loading. I mean, it's not seismic, but it's wind. And so we design for wind. They consider, because safety is our top priority, they did consider wind. But I don't think what they considered, and once the fix was put into place, we were beginning to try to find steel to replace the I-bar to match the fracture critical steel of the existing I-bar. And the idea was a temporary fix, so the notion of it staying out there for 5 years was not on our radar screen. What we were trying to do is take the loading off of that ruptured I-bar, put it into external rods. If we could look back and change the course of history and go back, we would probably we would tie the ends down, conical nuts. We'd go on a daily basis. But at the time, with the information that we had, with our engineers taking a look with T.Y. Lin, all of them looking together and working on this problem, this was the fix that was developed.
Well, let me ask a question. Do you think if you'd had a year instead of a few days, you would have had a better understanding of what the design needed to be?
Well, if we had a year, we would have just replaced the I-bar like we did ultimately.
All right. Well, the reason I'm probing on this issue is because I think Caltrans has done a very good job of assuring the public that safety comes first and you don't want to rush. And, I heard your spokesman over and over and over again on the news say, we're going to take as long as it takes to get it right. But when you took as long as it takes to get it right, it didn't get done right. So I think the question is what was the job, in fact, hurried or rushed, and would additional time have provided greater insight into the design necessities, which were only understood after 5,000 pounds came crashing down on the highway?
Going back to do it again, that fix would be in place. I think the modifications that we had, the ability to go back in time and take what we've learned today, we would more than likely, we would have tied the ends off, we would of the high strength rods, so they're tethered. We would have put dampeners up on initially, but that wasn't at the time and it wasn't a rushed design. We were taking our time. We had our top engineers. I think the best way to say it is we were moving as quickly as possible while not hurrying. I mean, what we're trying to do is understand the relationship to make sure that the bridge is open for the holiday seasons. But the focus was a safe design, and that's what we always apply to our repair jobs.
But the question we're getting from our constituents, and which I'm passing along to you, is if all of the best talent available to Caltrans on this extraordinary project was brought to bear in designing a fix, how did they miss the problem that ultimately caused the failure? And absent an answer to that question, I don't know what the answer is, that's why I'm asking. Absent an answer to that question, how are we ever going to assure our constituents that they can feel safe as they cross the bridge the next time we confront a repair like this? So my question again is, with all of the best talent available that was brought to bear, and I think you've done a very good job of communicating today all of the great talent that you brought to bear on the problem quickly and with a great deal of focus, but it didn't work, and the question is why? And as I said, if there was some extraordinary circumstance that no one could have anticipated, that's one thing. But I haven't heard you say that. I've heard you say that there are conditions on the bridge that's been in operation for 73 years, that weren't anticipated when the original design was put in place. And if I've misspoken, you please correct me, because I don't want to do that. I really want to try and figure out what went wrong here.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, let me take a stab at that. And believe me, your fundamental question, obviously, we've asked of ourselves many, many times. It's obviously a very good question. I think, and at least this is my opinion, that the event on October 27th really was an extraordinary situation. Yes, there's wind on the bridge all the time. Yes, we did think about wind. You have to think about wind. But what you had was really an extraordinary, probably confluence, a perfect storm, if you will, of a combination of things. It's not that it was high wind necessarily, but it was that there was wind at a specific speed coming from a specific direction, combining with the very unique natural resonance frequency of those rods as they were stressed, given the particular stress level that was applied to those rods. And there are different stress levels applied to the individual rods. What most likely occurred was what's referred to as a galloping event. They're very, very uncommon, very, very unique to particular situations. Basically, that rod took off and saw motions that nobody probably would have anticipated, just extraordinary motions, which really is reflected in some of the forensics that we have seen to date. I think it is fair to characterize what happened on the 27th as an extraordinary set of circumstances.
There was, and I appreciate the chair's patience with me, there was reference to external peer review after the failure. Was there external peer review of the fix in real time as you were making it, including the design?
There was peer review to the extent there was the group of engineers that Director Iwasaki described. We had our own internal group of engineers.
I heard that as being, though, folks who were sort of part of the team.
Yes.
Okay. And that would be distinguishable, yes, from external peer review?
I do think we have characterized, for example, the Blue Ribbon panel that has been involved in the assessment of the repair since that date as an external review committee. We do use external review committees in many cases. It may be just an issue of nomenclature. I would tend to say there were a lot of external eyes, if you will, that were involved in that first repair. We may not have given it the title of an external peer review, but yes, there were a lot of folks who did have their eyes on that, and nobody identified this issue.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm still troubled by the sort of inability to get our arms around the what went wrong question, but I appreciate the information that's been provided.
Thank you. Senator Leno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Simitian, hopefully might have a clue to the question you're asking. I want to put this in a little broader perspective. And correct me if some of my numbers are off, but there are 1,680 I-bars on the entirety of the bridge? That's correct? So 1,680. Was this the very first one over 73 years to experience a crack?
That I know of, yes.
So there's nothing recorded in the history of the bridge. So this is a unique first-time occurrence?
Yes.
And I would imagine subsequently every one of the 1,679 other I-bars at both ends have been checked and double-checked throughout.
Yes, sir.
And there's nothing else. So this just one is quite amazing after 73 years that there is just this one. So I want to add to your list of design and manufacture and installation and review. What I haven't heard, was there between the fix in early September and the events of October 27th, a daily assessment of how the design, manufacture, installation was faring?
Between the time...
Was someone keeping an eye on it every day, given that it was a unique situation? So
no.
This is, I think, the missing point here then. Given that we were on uncharted territory, we've never had a crack in 73 years of 1,680 I-bars, you had to make a repair. You did, with every professional confidence you thought it had been done appropriately and was sufficient. But I would think that there, and I would hope in the future, there is the daily assessment component to add to the four that Senator Simitian has, even after the final peer review, that in such a situation, we've got to have someone keeping an eye on that every day. And this is, I guess, my last question. Was it a single incident on October 27th, a shift of wind, a tort, or something that caused it to happen in a flash? Or was it the result of weeks of wear and tear because of this slight fault in design that it got finally stressed on October 27th and failed? Because if that was the case, having a daily reassessment of the design, manufacture, and installation may have caught someone's eye prior to it finally failing October 27th.
We inspected the fix, the original fix, on a weekly basis.
A weekly basis?
A weekly basis.
And no one noticed anything whatsoever?
No. After the fix was repaired, it was on a daily basis, and we actually got in there with a borescope. So we had people climbing all over that fix, looking at, making sure that bar was centered, not touching metal. They had to make adjustments to make sure that it stayed away from the embedding itself on the end of a bearing. But we did everything we could on a daily basis. So we went to where you wanted to be after the fix.
Senator Smitty, that might be the missing piece.
That's the second fix you're talking
Yes.
about.
Right.
Remember, I need to understand.
Between the first and the second,
the repair of the fix.
after it was reviewed,
There was,
not
there
peer
was a
reviewed, but
weekly.
reviewed.
There was a weekly.
And it wasn't with the detail of the now daily reassessment.
Right.
You said you
Yes.
used a term I'm not familiar with. It was a
Borescope?
okay.
Yeah, they actually get in with a camera and they look at it to make sure they have the clearance.
Right. So and that was not done
No.
after the first. Yeah.
I mean, initially it was, but on a weekly basis, they looked at the bars, made sure it looked like they were centered.
And we could guess that if there had been the daily with the scope after the first, someone would have noticed this is not working as we had hoped prior to October 27th.
Yes, you'd think that someone would catch that.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Leno. Senator Henn.
Thank you, Senator Lowenthal. Is there, to me, one of the things that I want to know more about is the peer review, external peer review, internal peer review. I wasn't totally clear from the way you described it if there is either internal Caltrans policy or legislative policy regarding when an external peer review is triggered.
We do not have a policy at Caltrans when we don't use a peer review.
But internal, external, because here we had an internal team doing the design
Right.
without outsiders coming in, and then the installation. So there was not an external peer review for that. I understand now there has been an external peer review on the subsequent fix.
Well, I guess in a broader context, we have a seismic advisory board that helps guide our seismic policies and design criteria. So we do have an external kind of peer review we use for certain items. 5 years ago, when we were in hearings in the same room talking about the Bay Bridge, we brought in peer reviews for constructability, peer reviewed our schedule, peer reviewed our budget. So we do that. In this case, when the fix fell on the ground, I said I want an external peer. I don't want anybody that's involved in the construction, the design. I want somebody external. So we turned to Dr. Frieder Sibley, who is the dean of the Jacobs School of Engineering of UC San Diego, and then a professor that's a structural steel expert. And so I made the call to bring in an external peer review, and that's what they did. Do we do that on every situation? The MacArthur Maze, we did not bring in an external review team, but once the fix came down, I wanted an external peer review.
Okay, so I'm interested in when an external peer review gets triggered in extraordinary circumstances like this, which is the IBAR showing that it had really quite a large crack in it and having it had to get fixed. In terms of the daily and possible daily inspections instead of weekly inspections, would Caltrans have the capacity to do that? And how long would you need to keep it up in light of furloughs, staff redirections, or whatever?
We do not have the resources to do that on a daily basis. We redirect to do that and to make sure that the fix was being monitored properly. That's why we went out. After the fix was installed, we began looking for a more permanent fix, which requires less observation, less maintenance. And so the answer to your question is no, we don't have the resources to do that on a daily basis. We're not doing that on a daily basis now. What we're doing is we're inspecting the 16 I-bar chains that look much like the diagonal I-bar chains on the bridge. We're doing that on a 3-month basis, and we're continuing our 2-year inspection program on the rest of the structure.
Okay. And then just finally, what is the role of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission vis-a-vis Caltrans in oversight of both the new construction, which I know MTC is taking a lead on, but then this kind of emergency action on the bridge?
It's an interesting role. MTC, BADA, collects the tolls, and they bond, and then they provide us with revenue to do bridge rehabilitation. They pay for some of our bridge inspection. They pay for the Region Measure 1 projects 2, and I think they have Region Measure 3, but Region Measure projects. that's the role. But AB 144 created an oversight committee of which we have BATA, Caltrans, and the California Transportation Commission working together to oversee the seismic retrofit program, which is all that's left is the east span replacement. And so they have a role as a funder, but they also have a role as an oversight to Senator Simitian's overall question about the schedule and when is the ultimate bridge replacement going to occur.
But they weren't involved in this.
They were involved in the sense that the first fix was I asked the Federal Highway Administration for a verbal approval to use federal HBP money. I thought that our policy internally is if it's a $3 million fix or greater, what we try to do is federalize the fix, and we're running out of state money. And so what I want to do is federalize it. So I got a verbal approval from the division administrator. The second fix, the repair of the fix, I asked the division administrator for a verbal approval to use federal money on that as well, and received that. When the ultimate I-bar replacement occurred, that's more bridge rehabilitation, and so I asked for BATA to fund that, which they agreed to do. So that's kind of the relationship in the progression of how the various actions occurred as far as funding.
Thank you.
I'd like on one question following up Senator Hancock. In the funding for the ongoing, you talked about that you're still doing ongoing inspections on the bridge now. For, let's say, we also know that there's another 1,680 I-bars also. And I think you said that, I don't recall how frequently now you're inspecting not only this part of the bridge, but all the other I-bars on the bridge. Who is paying for that? That inspection that's going on now, is MTC paying for any of that? The inspections?
Part of it. Barton, do you want to? Barton can help you answer that question.
Okay. The inspection of the toll bridges is essentially paid for by the BATA group, Bay Area Transportation Authority. There is also some level of inspection that is performed that is funded by the federal government with a state match using the HPP, which the director mentioned, which is Highway Bridge Program federal funds. Right now, this increased inspection every 3 months of those 16 I-bar locations. Those are the critical I-bar locations that are receiving a increased frequency of every 3 months. The remaining portion of the bridge is still being inspected on a 2-year frequency. The 16 I-bar locations are those that we feel that warrant the increased inspection because of the nature of the I-bar chain. And that right now is being captured with existing resources. And so what we're doing is we're shifting around some of the bridge inspection work that they typically would be doing to that effort. And that's how.
Who's funding the 16? It's BATA.
It would be BATA, Bay Area Transportation. Yes, sir.
Agency, funding that. What? Now you've kind of described to us the scenario of the original identification of the I-bar, the crack, the initial fix in it, which included both design, construction of the fix, the development of the fix, the implementation of it, and then the review of it, and then the ongoing inspections, and then the failure, and then the outside review, and now the fixing of that, the peer review, the external peer review that ultimately took place. How much does all this cost? And now the ongoing. What are we talking about?
Fix 1, approximately $1.5 million. The repair of the fix is going to be around $5 million. The difference is the original fix, the lane closures, the traffic control, the enhanced BART service was funded out of the rollout and roll-in of the detour section. So the second repair of the fix, we paid for the BART, enhanced BART service, and we paid for traffic control. So the bills are going to come in. They're not all in yet for both those two projects, as well as the third for that matter. But it's going to be around $5 million. And then the I-bar the head and then the splice and the bar and the splice, all that labor and materials is probably going to be around $7 million. So you get about $14 million.
$14 million up until now.
Yes.
To fix the I-bar.
To fix the I-bar.
The one.
The one, yes.
How much would a new I-bar cost?
Oh, in this case, you couldn't. What Barton's relating to, there's 16 locations where you have a series of I-bars with an intermediate pin that float, in essence. And they go into two fixed locations. So in order to replace that, it's very, very complex. So you wouldn't necessarily, I don't think you'd be able to pull the bar out of that series of chains and replace it. I think the ultimate fix that we used is probably the best you're going to do for that type of configuration. It's not like going from a fixed pin to a fixed pin and then being able to shore the structure up and replacing that one bar. This is a very complex series of 8 bars.
So to try to replace it would put in jeopardy the existing suspension system and
the truss system, yes.
That's right. And so you cannot just replace I-bars, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Is that the design that we'll ever use again?
No.
That's
It's ill-advised. It's not accepted by the design community, so they don't use it. There's probably very few, if any, designers that would use that system anymore.
Well, we've asked you to kind of stop. Let's get back to what you'd like to present to us if there are issues that you still haven't, because I know the committee will still want to ask questions. And so this was just a temporary interlude started by Senator Simitian, and now we're ready to get back to your president, which I think is very important. I think these were some of the critical issues, and I think you've done, I think there's still some questions, I think, that were raised under what are the procedures for external peer review? When do you do that? When is internal peer review done? Is this an unusual situation that you went to two outside people? You said you called them up. Does that happen in other situations? I'm just not clear on when Caltrans does it within their own consultants, their own internal review process, and when you say, wait a second, this may be more complex. Let's get, as you pointed out, you did right away, say, let's get some of the experts from University of California at San Diego, and then I think University of Nevada at Reno. Yes. Let's get those folks. I'm just wondering, is this a typical procedure? When do you do things like this? And I just
Senator Lowenthal, before we pass it back, I do want to go back to Senator Leno's, I thought, very good line of questioning, because the final question he asked was I thought also key, which was if this is a unique event, if this is a once in a lifetime experience, then folks are obliged to craft a unique once in a lifetime fix. But the question Senator Leno raised, which I think is so important to keep in our minds as we go forward, is if you're obliged to provide a once-in-a-lifetime fix to a once-in-a-lifetime problem, doesn't it bear watching on a pretty constant basis in the immediate aftermath of that fix? And I don't want Senator Leno's question and the response, which I appreciated, to be lost. I think that's key.
And the response being that it's, I think, being observed on a weekly basis.
I think again, hindsight, the answer I heard was we looked weekly, not daily. If we'd looked daily, we might have spotted this before it came crashing down. And in the aftermath of the crash, we're looking more regularly than we were before. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and we're also going to use external gauges on key locations to tell us how that bridge is performing for the next 4 or 5 years, whatever the length is as it's in service. I did remember something. I'm getting older, but the question about peer review. When our bridge designers type select a bridge and their design and whatever the type of bridge they're going to use into the future, that decision is peer reviewed. Am I correct?
External.
Yeah. Well, it's internal peer review, but another set of eyes takes a look at that. So my answer to you was flawed in the sense that, yes, we do have policies in place to do peer review. I just remembered that. It just, for whatever reason, popped into my head.
And I apologize, but Senator Hancock just said one word. She said external ? Yes. And I think that's an important distinction because, I think when you work together on an important and complex project and you have a team mentality, which is so important to the successful completion of that effort, it becomes tough. We all know this from whatever our lines of work may be. It becomes tough to review the work with the same degree of independence and rigor and candor that somebody from outside with no investment in the outcome has. And I think that's why, if I were going to underscore something as well as Senator Leno's comment, it would be Senator Hancock's focus on the importance of, I mean, you know, in our offices, we sometimes come up with things we think are a pretty good idea, and hopefully someone in our office says, why don't we ask around a little bit about that before you do that? And that often keeps our decision-making a little better than it might have been. So.
Thank you. By the way, AB 144 was a very good bill.
Thank you.
Senator, we have Senator DeSaulnier.
I just want to jump in very briefly, and Randy, I'm anxious to have you finish your presentation. But I think it's important, although we're focused on the IBAR, and this is maybe just because I have a lot of history with this particular project, having been on BATA for 10 years during much of this, and was at the bill signing at Treasure Island when Governor Wilson signed the bill to do the replacement project. In the context of this bridge, no one should be on it right now. We decided to build a new bridge because we, the legislature, local government, and Governor Wilson at that time and the engineers decided it would be safer and more cost-effective, although at that time just a little more expensive. It's become much more expensive to replace the entire bridge. So it's impossible in my mind's eye, when you did that original assessment, Caltrans and peer-reviewed it, that every bolt and every part of the cantilever part of the bridge, the whole bridge on the eastern span, was seismically unsafe. And we've been living with that, and you've been doing the best you can under those circumstances. So not to bring a sense of alarm and not to say that we shouldn't be asking the kind of questions that we are asking, but in the context of this bridge, it's a very busy bridge that's been degraded by time and by Loma Prieta in 1989. It was supposed to be closed and replaced a long time ago. There is a lot of responsibility for that, some of it to be understood, not some of it, in my view, political and otherwise. So I just want to make those comments in the context, which also brings part of the question is, knowing all those things, it requires a higher sense of review, given that the public still travels through there, and we know that they're at higher risk because not just this IBAR, but every bolt in that bridge has been degraded to a point that no one expected it to still be in working shape. Sorry, and thank you for indulging me. It just felt good saying that, having been through this many times. We used to call this the Poltergeist Project at BATA.
Well, thank you for placing it in the larger context of not just talking about a particular IBAR or the 1,600 IBARs, but really the overall condition of that bridge itself, and that it is a degraded bridge, and it is a bridge that I think now, what was that, that was over 20 years ago, was decided to be
yeah.
Very interesting. Please continue.
So after the fix, our engineers are out looking for fracture critical steel to put a more permanent fix in place and trying to build a hairpin and getting the splice pieces together, but they have to find the right steel. It has to be tested. It has to be fracture critical steel, which is more ductile than normal steel. It has to have the same properties as the existing IBAR that's in place. And so they're out looking for that. They ultimately found the steel, the plate steel, and they sent it to a location in Vallejo, a fabricator called XKT.
Fabricator meaning what? What is a fabricator?
A fabricator will take a piece of plate steel and shape it into something. In this case, shape it into like a magnet, a U shape. They call it a hairpin. And so the plate steel was secured. It was tested by METS within a few days. It had the same properties, fracture critical properties, as the existing IBAR that was in, or IBARs that are in place. We have two of those. We had two of those. We had one that assumed, well, then we had a design. So we did a design, and the design was, let's cut 12 feet out of that existing bar, peel that eye away from the pin, expose the pin, that floating pin that you all see in the picture. Assume that it's round, assume that it's in good shape after 73 years. And then we had on the lathe the hairpin, and this design was designed in-house. It was peer-reviewed by the Blue Ribbon panel, the external review. We hired another contractor, American Bridge, who happens to be replacing the East Span, doing the SAS work. They have a shop right there at Pier 7. So American Bridge Floor was the contractor that was hired. They have done eye-bar replacements in the past, but not as complex as this, but just straight eye-bar repair, so that we were confident that we had a good contractor. We had a good design that was peer-reviewed. We found the necessary steel to make the replacement of the eye bar, the little 12 feet of it. In the meantime, on the fracture, the fractured portion of the eye, we drilled out the face of it to get it to a forensics metallurgist expert to find out, what really happened. Did the crack start from the pin side and work its way out? Did the crack start on the outside, work its way in? What were the causalities or causes of that failure? So all these things came into play. We hired American Bridge Floor. We had 2 hairpins, one lathed out, assuming a 13-inch perfectly round pin, and another one sitting on the lathe getting ready to go in case if we needed to make modifications. The bar itself was heated to take any remaining stress or tension out of that bar for worker safety. There was no tension left in that bar, so our engineer's calculation was correct that there was no tension being carried in that bar. It was over a series of lane closures removed, and the hairpin was put into place, spliced into place. Splice plates are bolted together with the eye-bar extension, the splice down here, a splice plate here, and the hairpin. It was tensioned up. The goal was to get it to 500 kips. Ultimately, the final tension or load in that replacement bar is about 490 kips. Everything worked pretty well. The geometry, once the eye bar failed, the pin is no longer parallel to the ground. It's rotated. So the fix moved the pin back to normal. So the geometry of the eye bar system is in good place. So one of the questions would be, are we going to do anything else to that location? And the answer is currently we're looking at it, but it doesn't appear we're going to need to do any more modifications to that. That's the good news. The other good piece of news is we have a hairpin on a lathe or in inventory if another eye bar fails. So Barton has sent in working with his consultant, Larry McKnight from down south, they've taken a look at the fracture, the face of that fracture. They've determined that the crack came from the outside and worked its way in. That's going to help us because now what Barton's team does is they look on the outside of all those eye bars and they do dye penetrant. They're going to look at all of them. They haven't looked at all of them with that kind of. Have you looked at all 1680 on the outside of the eye?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that, in fact, as soon as the fracture happened, we were out on those 16 locations and we took a look at the edge, anticipating that was the cause, that the crack initiated from the outside and worked towards the pin, and went along those edges, removed the paint, and ground out any imperfections that were along those edges that could cause a crack initiation. So we have done that now. We are almost complete. We had a few access issues. Within the next few weeks, we'll be completely done with all of those 16 locations, as well as we've also taken a look at all of the pins in those eye bar chains, where we use a technique called ultrasonic testing and examine the pins to see if there's any kind of flaws or problems, and everything looks really good. And it was very encouraging for us that once we removed the eye bar head of the existing fractured bar, we looked at the surface of the pin and it was in very good shape. So that was very encouraging for us. We will be looking at some instrumentation. Once we get some material property results from Larry McKnight of his company on the toughness of the steel, that'll tell us some very important information regarding crack propagation, critical crack length, things that will help us do the right thing when it comes to instrumenting the bridge. And we will continue looking at all of those edges, and we will continue to use the dye penetrant testing. Every fracture critical inspection that we do every 3 months, we will do that again. So we are aggressively monitoring and managing that situation.
Thank you. So it's not just regular paint. There's lead paint underneath, so we have to be very careful of how we eliminate the paint and contain it and make sure we do all that very carefully. So it's not just like going and sanding off some paint, because we were concerned about our employee safety as well as the public. So that's the eye bar repair work, ultimate repair work. It looks like the splice, the extender bar, the bar, and then the splice and the new hairpin is working fabulously. The geometry is right. We're doing some more monitoring. Barton's going to order some more strain gauges. And we are going, and then what we found, Larry McKnight, on his initial response, because what we're looking at now is how fast did the crack propagate from outside to inside. But what he also noted is that, well, other than we're going to make sure that we inspect the outside of the pin.
Well, the first report that we received on the fractured eye bar has indicated to us that the fracture was a fatigue fracture, and that it was caused by stresses that were not only in tension, like if you were pulling a rubber band, which is expected of the eye bar, that's how it's designed, but also in some bending and maybe some torsional stresses from the lateral movement because the eye bar was attached to that floating pin. And there was no fixity, if you will, on that pin. So that rotation over 73 years finally, at that point, fractured. The crack initiated and then it fractured. So that's why those locations at those floating pins are so important to us. We know that now, and he's validated that original assumption. And then the next report, which is expected in the next few weeks here from him, will give us the material properties.
Yeah, I just have one question, then I want to go to one statement, then I want to go to Senator Leno, I think, has a statement. I want to follow up on something that Senator DeSaulnier said, that after this was a bridge that was degraded, severely degraded after the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the overall bridge, or at least a significant part of it, not just the specific eye bar. This was a bridge that was now going to be replaced. That was over 20 years ago. It still has not been completely replaced. We're talking about another 4 to 5 years before this is completed. Do you perceive this as a disaster waiting to happen, that something else, not just the eye bar, but that this is a degraded bridge that has tremendous amount of traffic? It gets back to why we originally had this hearing. Besides the fix of this, whether this eye bar is going to work or not, or whether, would you say that potentially there could be other issues as a result, not only of the bridge being 73 years old, but the bridge going through this earthquake that really impacted the bridge? Could we be looking at ultimately other kinds of disasters in the next 4 to 5 years?
It's a seismically deficient bridge that has been internally retrofitted. There could be a problem. That we just had a 6.5 earthquake off of Ferndale. Thank God it was in the ocean. This bridge is right near the Hayward and San Andreas faults. And so that's why when we talk about accelerating this bridge, and why we have so much focus and so much time, is we're in a race to seismic safety. And so we're very concerned about that.
Okay, Senator Leno.
For those of us who use the bridge regularly, we know we have been on borrowed time for now over 20 years. It's just a fact of life, and it's been for the grace of God that we're as well off as we are.
And that this 5,000 ton or pound did not fall on one of the senators returning from Sacramento or assembly members.
I may have missed something in the presentation, but you've made reference now to the 16 eye bars a couple of times. How were 16 determined out of the 1,680 to be kept more closely watched than the others? Was it a random selection, or these are 16 that have some special meaning to them? And if you've already explained this, excuse me.
No, there's 16 locations where you have diagonal eye bars. It's on your photo number 4.
Yes, on page 4.
You have 16 of these locations that Barton and his team are paying close attention to, because you have that mid pin in there. The rest of those eye bars, the 1,600, they're fixed, so that they're going to one top and one bottom.
I see the difference.
And so those are very, very critical, and we're paying very close attention to those 16 locations.
Very good. Thank you.
So to go back now, so that we've got a permanent fix, hopefully, so it will last till the end, and when we replace this bridge, everybody will be a lot happier and a lot safer. The original roll out and roll in was to put a detour in place so that we could clear an area to build a new structure, the new structure. So you have in your packet a picture that looks like this. We're talking about the S-curve. I'm trying to get to the S-curve now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So you have, and the key piece here, because people ask, is it unsafe? Is this detour? Why couldn't you design it for 70 miles an hour? The structure itself is signed for 50 miles an hour, and it's been that way for a long time. The problem in the detour here is ultimately your new bridge is going to come along the same path and enter into the double-deck Yerba Buena Island Tunnel. So you have to meet that with the end of the self-anchored suspension bridge. And so we just received bids on the Yerba Buena Island transition structure, and that ultimate structure will attach to the end of the self-anchored suspension bridge and transition the travelers from a side-by-side structure. You can view the stars, you can see the sun, the moon in the future, but it has to transition back into a double-deck tunnel. And so you have to clear that right away in order to make that space clear. And so what we did is we built a short radius curve, a straight section, and then another curve, putting you back onto the existing structure. As we showed Senator Simitian and Senator Leno, from underneath that structure, you're tied at one end is the start of the truss section. At the other end, you're tied at the tunnel. And so you only have so much right-of-way in order to put geometrically a detour in place. And so our engineers took a look at those short radius curves, and there's a straight section, relatively straight section in between, and we signed that at 40 miles an hour. And we gave an advisory for trucks at 35 miles an hour. And so these are some of the pre-construction advertisements, and on the bottom it says, please be advised, the speed limit's going to be lowered to 40 miles an hour through the S-curve. These same advertisements have gone out on Doyle Drive. We spend $1 million probably on each closure on just outreach alone, telling people what to expect, telling our customers what to expect. I think the results are we're getting better at it. I think Doyle Drive, there was an article about how smooth it went, and we're using the same outreach techniques that we used on the East Span project, the Detour project, on the Doyle Drive project. And so we're learning. But in here, this is an advertisement that talks about the 40 miles an hour. The detour itself that's in place today is not super elevated, which means you don't bank into curves because it's a bridge deck, so it's flat. And so at 40 miles an hour, it operates very nicely, but we added enhancements, and there's a whole number of enhancements that if you want to hear about them, I can have Tony go through the enhancements. But in preparation, we put things like changeable message signs up that said slow down.
Let me interrupt if I may. Senator Lowenthal is stepping out because he's got a vote obligation in natural resources. So please know it's not that he's stepping away. And then I may have to do the same. Senator Lowenthal has been kind enough to hand me the gavel, and I'll preside briefly while he's gone. Thank you. And that being said, I'll take this opportunity to interrupt for a moment and ask a question, if I may, which is this. I do not want to second-guess you on the decision to use an S-shaped replacement. I take your point about the constraints of the space, and I think you make a credible argument there. I do want to second-guess a little bit on the issue of what it takes to provide adequate and effective notice to, 250,000 people plus who go across that bridge every day. And, it's a big and busy metropolitan area that you serve. Folks have challenges in their daily lives. There's a lot of noise out there competing for attention. And as we've discussed earlier, we've got 73 years worth of history in terms of what people expect and frankly internalize as they drive across. They're not even mindful of it. We all sort of find ourselves on autopilot, I'm afraid, from day to day. The concern that I'd like you to address is my understanding is that there was a significant number of accidents in the immediate aftermath of the installation of the S-curve. Is that a fair characterization?
Actually, after the first 3 days, there were no accidents. The accidents picked up on the fourth, that started on the fourth day when people got used, well, I don't know why, but on the fourth day, we started seeing a number of accidents.
All right. And to what do we attribute that? That's the next question.
Well, most of the reports that I have read and newspaper articles that I've read they're speed related.
Okay. And are we talking about folks going 5 or 10 miles over the limit, or are we talking about folks going 20 or 30 miles over the limit?
Yeah, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Okay. Well, look, here's the concern I've got. It seems to me, as one member of the committee, in the aftermath of the S-curve, we had an uptick in accidents for some reason. If it's speed related, then the question is, why weren't we more effective at regulating speed in that location? Was there inadequate notice? And by inadequate, I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean simply ineffective. If it didn't work, it was inadequate. It was ineffective. Was there inadequate signage or ineffective signage? My understanding is that the signage has been increased since the S-curve was first in place. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And and my understanding as well is that you indicated earlier that you think you've learned some lessons from how all that was handled that you've been able to apply to subsequent changes on the bridge. Did I get that part right as well?
Yes, we have tried to direct and change our focus, and so we've made some modifications.
Let me try it this way. Understanding that you've said, the S-curve really was pretty much a requirement given the context and the limitations of the situation. If you had it to do over again, what would you have done differently? You've clearly come up with a different design, for example, on the I-bar. So what would the different design look like in terms of controlling speed if that has been the critical variable on the S-curve? What's the takeaway lesson?
Well, I think you want yeah, because I wanted to.
Let me take a stab at that for you, Senator. We did do a tremendous amount of outreach prior to opening the curve up. It was really based on a knowledge base we developed on our West Approach project over in the city of San Francisco, the westerly approach to the Bay Bridge. There were a number of instances where we had some pretty significant temporary traffic shifts because we were replacing that entire mile-long stretch of freeway, replacing it entirely in the urban setting with a very, very narrow right-of-way. So you had a very similar situation, a lot of tight curves that you had to put in place on a temporary basis. And we actually were very successful in outreach over there. And one of the things that we did that we found particularly useful were video simulations. We actually would try and give a driver's eye perspective of how the road's going to look tomorrow when you drive through it. We would put those on television. We'd do PSA spots. We would actually get the media to support us. They would put it on the news. They would maintain it on their websites. We would maintain that on our websites. And I remember one particularly challenging traffic shift that we made that went exceptionally smoothly, and I think probably in large part due to that video simulation. We followed all of those same steps with the S-curve. We did some very substantial video simulations. They were broadcast well beyond even just the printed material that you've seen here. And there was a significant amount of signage that was in place. We actually had an increased CHP presence from day one out there. Their enforcement capability was probably somewhat limited because we didn't have lane closures for them to operate in and out of.
Forgive the interruption, but if I could just how long did the increased CHP coverage last?
It's still in place as of today with the additional enforcement capability that they now have with some of the lane closures that we put in when traffic permits.
But how long did it stay at the level that it was at day 1 and day 2 and day 3?
It has stayed in place and actually increased as of, I believe it was November 11th.
So if I could take you back to the previous question about, so what do we think is the basis for the uptick in problems on day 4 and subsequent days? Is it that people sort of thought they'd got the hang of it and got overconfident?
That's a possibility, and again, it's very, very hard to say. It's also hard to say is the substantial decrease that we've seen in accidents, is that solely attributable to enforcement? Is it in part due to some of the increased signing? Is it due to some additional outreach? It's probably all of the above.
Or notice in the paper of the tragic loss of life that's occurred at that location.
Absolutely. That very well may have gotten folks' attention.
So I apologize. I took you off track because the question we were trying to get an answer to is, so, benefit of hindsight now, what if we had it to do again, what else, if anything, would we do in addition to what we did on the S-curve?
The only thing I can think of is to perhaps further highlight the message when the experience we had on the West Approach The message was probably solely focused on the traffic shift. In this case, we had some pretty amazing work going on over Labor Day weekend, and that was a big part of the message. And information that was going out there. So it was not just it's going to be 40 miles an hour and there's going to be an S-curve in place. That was a substantial element, but there was other information out there as well. Perhaps that needs to be carved out more specifically. Perhaps it is the additional signage. I think for the next go-around, if we were faced with that again, we would do all of the things that we've done since that date and probably more.
How long did the uptick in increased accidents occur? Do you have to go back and look at day 4 through?
Yeah, I believe from September 8th through September 11th, those were the days we saw no accidents. Between that date, roughly September 11th, and 2 months later, I believe it was November 11th when we had the increased CHP enforcement and some additional signage in place, we saw about 42 accidents occurring in that quarter.
And what would be normal in that quarter? 0, 2, or 3?
Well, we went back and we looked at that, and we've got two metrics that we use when we're looking at accident rates. We have actual accident rates that we develop on a statewide basis for comparable facilities. The accident rate that we were seeing during that 2-month period, the 42 accidents, was actually below our standard metric of what we would expect. But another comparison is what was happening on the bridge, roughly in that same general location in the years prior to the installation of the S-curve. And the rate was about half of what we were seeing during that period. So clearly there was an increase that occurred during that 2-month period.
All right. Comments or questions from other members of the committee? Assemblymember Buchanan.
Thank you. As someone who was born in San Francisco and has been traveling the Bay Bridge for many years, I have children who now live in San Francisco. One daughter commutes daily across the bridge. Let me just say, if there's one disappointment from people that I know, it's that we didn't start building the new bridge sooner. I mean, the Loma Prieta quake was in 1989, and I think there's no excuse for a legislature taking well over a decade to replace a bridge that they know seismically should have been replaced a number of years ago. Past that, in any project there can be lessons learned, but I also want to compliment you on the incredible job you are doing with the Bay Bridge, because when you look at the first closure you had, and it was a couple years ago when you closed over Labor Day weekend, you were able to open earlier. With this closure, if we hadn't had the fracture in the I-bar, you would have been ahead of schedule. And, to a certain extent, my daughter said, it's going to take a month because it's just like when you have the first rain, you have more accidents. People who travel every day get used to it, but someone who's not used to traveling, oftentimes, they think if it says 40, they can go 55. And we know the one Therese traffic, the accident with the bridge, or with the truck, was the result of excess speed. So there's no doubt that the flashing lights you have now that say 40 miles per hour help remind people that they need to slow down. There's no doubt that the newspaper reports of the accidents help remind people locally that there's a problem, and when they say 40, it means 40 miles per hour. But I do think you've done an excellent job also of communicating with people in advance of both bridge closures in terms of what to expect, from being able to click on your website and see the simulation of what's going to happen to having it on the news constantly in the papers. So my hope is that if there are lessons that need to be learned, we learn them when we apply them, like we're applying them to the Doyle Bridge, Doyle Drive situation. But I don't want all this to overshadow the great job that you are doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Leno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I move on, let me just underscore the Assemblywoman's comments. It was a very fascinating tour that Senator Smitty and I took with you the other day, just to be reminded of the enormous accomplishment of the original construction of the 1930s, that the bridge is still there after all it's gone through, and then what you're trying to do to it, continually allowing for 250,000 cars to cross it every day. It's quite a feat, so that should not go unnoticed. I hope for the committee's benefit, and Senator Hancock and I have been talking about this, a greater understanding as to how decisions were made, and they certainly predate your directorship. with regard to a design of the bridge that then required the not only manufacture of the steel, but the fabrication of the steel to be done in China.
Okay.
So again, there was Chronicle coverage recently of the fact that the fabricated steel for the installation of the suspension span has now just left China and will be arriving in some weeks or month. But that because of some fabrication problems in China, welding, errors that were caught, it's been delayed by a year. And that's of great concern because we know we're on borrowed time. We've got to get this done as soon as possible. If you could walk us through a few things. What triggers the allowance, because there's federal law that says we must buy America. So what allows that to be triggered with this 25% threshold? But then backing up even further, how was it that from a variety of designs, one was chosen that preempted the possibility of our being able to, if not manufacture, at least do the fabrication in the country? Because there are delays, oversight that we lose control of as a result of it being done in China. And then there were clearly additional costs as a result of the faulty welding. You had to send personnel to China. There was a year's delay. What costs were experienced there? And then lastly, and I'm just throwing all of this out to you now because I have to go chair a committee of public safety in about 10, 15 minutes. With regard to the removal of the old bridge once all of your new construction on the eastern span is completed, is the funding already in place for that? What is the cost of it, and is that already in place? So I know it's a wide range of questioning. As I say, only throw it out. I may not have another opportunity to get a question out before I have to leave.
I was moving toward that because I think we've finished the S-curve part.
I think we did.
Okay. So, Buy America, initially there was a $5 billion bridge. We've broken it up into a series of contracts. What we try to do is make our contracts smaller to be more enticing for smaller businesses, disadvantaged business enterprises to get involved in the contracts. So I think the number's up to 16 now, 16 separate contracts. And the Skyway is a good example. That contract used federal dollars on it, so therefore the Buy America provisions are in place. It's only when you use federal money, okay? So in the case of the Skyway itself, when you federalized it, you brought in the Buy America. Buy America is not shall use, but it's if certain requirements are met, you can use international steel. And that means that you can bid with a domestic steel bid and an international steel bid. And if they're greater than 25%, you can use international steel. So the difference, greater than. So it's not a shall. On the SAS, the self-anchored suspension bridge contract that you took a look at with all the faults work out there, that is fully funded by BATA or non-federal funds. So Buy America does not apply.
Requirement at all. Right.
Okay. So when we first advertised that contract, we got one bidder. It was a $1.4 billion domestic steel or international steel bid, a $1.8 billion international steel bid, or 1.4 international, 1.8 domestic. Therefore, greater than 25%. So if we would have awarded that contract at that time, we could have awarded it using international steel. Now, there's nowhere that we have said anything disparaging about domestic steel manufacturers.
I'm misunderstanding something because you said in the SAS there was the Buy America did not even apply.
Buy America doesn't apply because we defederalized that contract.
Right.
The steel tub, the orthotropic box sections that you walked on at the end of the Skyway, those were manufactured at USI in Oregon.
Right, you had mentioned that.
It took, what, 2 years?
2 years. Yes.
2 years to manufacture just those two. We have 28 sections coming in from China. 14 sections 1 through 14, eastbound and westbound. So there's 28 of these, 300-foot long, 100-foot wide. How many feet deep are they?
Oh boy, it's probably 20 feet.
So it's a very large construction project. And so when we went out for the second bid, we defederalized, and we got two bidders. We got Kiewit, Nippon Steel. They had a joint venture, and then we had American Bridge Floor, and ultimately. Who's the vendor? ZPMZ.
Right.
So When we award to a prime, we don't tell them where to get their portion or the materials fabricated from. So we don't go out and say, oh, by the way, you have to go out and use X, Y, and Z to have the fabrication done. On the initial bid, when there was only one bidder, the difference was they were going to go out and create a fabrication site in the United States, and that $400 million difference, or was some of it or all of it, was set up to do that.
So with regard to the faulty welds that caused a year's delay, given that that's so far out of your hands, do you have any concerns whatsoever as to how that is arriving? You had to send personnel to China?
We have 50 of our engineers in China. The contractor has 200. And we test all the welds to ensure that they meet our criteria, Caltrans criteria. So the deck sections that are coming to California from China have all been checked, and they all meet the criteria.
Now, did you need to have those 50 people in place prior to the identification of the faulty welds?
Yes.
So nothing changed once they were noticed and after the fact?
No.
So that was all part of the original expected cost?
The Carquinez suspension bridge, that orthotropic box was manufactured in Japan.
What kind of costs of either material, time, manpower, whatever, occurred as a result of the year delay? And was that budgeted, or I know you have a contingency?
Well, the fabrication is delayed, but what we're trying to do is expedite the construction to get this thing, get the overall construction back on schedule. And so there's some opportunities that, working with the contractor and providing some incentives, we think that we can bring some of that schedule back into play. I didn't come ready to answer that exact question with calculations on the cost, but we can certainly get back to you.
If you could. So it's not inaccurate to suspect that there were additional costs as a result of the year's delay?
Yes.
And that would come out of an emergency fund?
That would come out of every quarter we send the legislature, it's a requirement of AB 144, it's a report. And it's a very detailed report with the schedule, the cost, the budget. But there was $900 million in contingencies that was put into AB 144, into the legislation. And so I believe the contingency fund, the actual contingency has dropped down to around $650 million, so that we've got into that $900 million. There is some risk associated when you read that, so it's even less when you look at all the risks. But there's also some bid savings that are occurring, so some money goes back. So we can try to calculate a number to answer your question, but does fabrication and delay, does the delays cost more money? Yes, and support, because you're out there for a year longer. Absolutely. I don't, go ahead, sorry.
One thing I'd like to add.
Gibson, who's the president and CEO of American Iron and Steel.
That's not the priority, Ben.
Because from your response to the questions raised in his letter to the editor,
This is
one could
there you go. Press it.
you haven't responded, and maybe after the fact at this point you want to just let it go. But you might, if you did not respond and I missed it, you might give some consideration because you got another story to tell. He's got it all wrong, and I understand that it could be sour grapes that he wanted to see manufactured and fabricated here in the United States, but for reasons you've already described, that wasn't even a possibility. And a lot of what he says in his letter is contrary to what you've mentioned today, I have no reason to doubt you whatsoever, but you might want to consider that just as information for the Chronicle readers.
And there is a project program to remove the existing east span once the new Bay Bridge is built. That the designers, the engineers will start working on that contract once we get closer to the time when we need it. And then it is programmed and will be funded out of the State Highway Operation Protection Fund.
And then you said
actually, no, it's part of the Toll Bridge program, estimated at $203.
And you already told us that the funding for the removal of the existing bridge is already budgeted and secure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would like to invite you to when the bridge deck, the portions come, just to see the complexity. It's a picture speaks 1,000 words. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lennon. I just want to follow up on one question. It's really just for me to understand about the welding. Is it not true, or I've been led to believe, that the fabrication or the welding in China is done by hand, and that some of the issues had to do with that, and that whether it's in Japan or if it was done in the United States, it's done by robotics, and which is a different process? Is that not true, that some of the problems that that were incurred have to do with the way the welding is done in China?
I think
that's a cost saving, but it may have added to the cost of this?
If you take a look at the way the orthotropic boxes, when they're built, they have stiffeners and struts in there at various angles, and there's no way, in some cases that I believe, at least in my opinion, that you can get a machine do a fillet weld in a situation where the metal is like this.
So if it was done either in Japan or in the United States, that it would not be done by robotic, is what you're saying? Even though China does it by hand, we would have to do the same process.
In certain locations, yes, because you have this.
Certain or all?
No, in certain locations. If this was the deck of the Bay Bridge, and we were putting two pieces of metal together, and that was the seam, they could run a machine across there and do that, because you can clamp it down and get everything right. So they do some of that.
They do, and there is automated welding that's going on for our project over in China. So it's a mix. Yes, there is.
To the same extent that it would be done here or in Japan?
Every fabricator will have its own means and methods. You will find variations, and I think it is fair to say that some may tend a little bit more on automated procedures versus hand welding. But Director Iwasaki is absolutely correct, especially in both the tower and the orthotropic box girder sections. There are sections you have to do by hand. It's very, very tight access, very, very difficult welding.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one last observation, since I had to step out to vote in the other committee. I don't want to let the S-curve issue slip away without just offering my observation that I think there clearly were some lessons learned, or that should have been learned, from the experience with the S-curve. And whether they were avoidable or not is another question and another debate. But I think there clearly were some lessons learned about how future circumstances ought to be dealt with, and how we can be more successful in making sure that the public is aware of the challenge and responds to the challenge and keeps not only themselves but other motorists safe. So I just, the goal here of having the various committees and subcommittees pulled together in this hearing is, as the Chairman Lowenthal mentioned earlier, is more about looking forward than looking back, and trying to make sure that the next time, and there's always a next time, we do an even better job based on what we've learned from this set of experiences. I believe that there are lessons that can and should be learned from the S-curve experience that should be put to use the next time we have to ask motorists to make an adjustment of this magnitude. Any other comments or questions before we?
I have just one.
Senator, thank you.
A follow-up to that, Senator Simitian. I would note that there are 52 local bridges still that are using these I-bars. And I'm wondering about how frequently they're inspected, if they should be inspected more. At least 6 of them have over 1,000 cars a day going across them. And I'd just like your comments on that. as well as some comments on, again, whether you have the staffing capacity to really keep an eye on those bridges.
The 52 locally owned bridges, we inspect those because they're deemed fracture critical. So whether they're in LA County or Santa Clara County, Barton and his team make sure that they're inspected. Some of them are actually inspected on a more frequent basis rather than 2 years. They're inspected on a yearly basis. But what we found is, and we've gone through all of the reports, there is no evidence of any problems that we've found so far, and Barton and his team have notified the public works directors in those cities or those counties where the bridges are owned that they have a bridge with an I-bar, and that we are taking a look at their bridge reports, and we'll be back on the cycle, that whatever the cycle is, to make sure that they're inspected properly. And with being fracture critical, we actually have to get out and, if this is a member, look at it and be able to be an arm's length of it. So we do all those things for those 52 bridges as if they were our own bridges.
That you were doing for the Bay Bridge.
Well, not on the 3-month cycle, but on a more frequent basis,
Yeah,
some on a yearly basis and some on a 2-year basis. But we treat it like they're our own.
Yeah, I'd like to just add that some of the reasons why the increased frequency is other elements of the bridge that need a closer look more often, and it is not the I-bars that are causing that trigger. So we're not doing more frequent inspections on those bridges because of I-bars. All of the I-bars are in very good condition based on the last fracture critical inspection, which is an arm's reach. A fracture critical inspection is basically you have to be right up on the member looking very closely at it. Once you've done that, my inspectors, through their process, and they're very highly skilled licensed engineers and structural steel inspectors certified, I am confident that we do not have any issues with I-bars on those bridges.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I know there are some other kinds of, what do they call it? Machine kind of sensing technology that can be used, or do you use literally looking for cracks, like the crack that was exposed on the Bay Bridge?
Yeah, we have a number of different methods for doing some of our steel inspection to detect cracks. Certainly, sensing technologies are used when warranted. Basically, when you have a known defect, then you would, and you want to monitor it on a more frequent basis, and it's labor intensive to go inspect it every day, we would use sensing technology. Otherwise, during our fracture critical inspection, what we will do is using, such as we mentioned before, the dye penetrant, where you actually flood the area with dye and it brings the crack out to a visual eye, to the naked eye. We have other techniques that we can use, ultrasonic testing apparatus to detect cracks. So we use a number of different methods to be able to actually find the defect, and then we have numerous methods to mitigate or arrest the crack, meaning stop the crack, and we do that on a regular basis. I mean, we manage these bridges very well, I think, and it shows.
Yeah, thank you. I would just make an observation to the committees and the members as we sort of move into this year of oversight, really looking at what we do, that bridge inspection is one of those invisible things that government does, but that we all depend on every day if we have to go over bridges. And that we really need to make sure that these things are adequately funded, and realizing that it takes people and expertise to do that. And even though we don't see the inspectors climbing around up there, they're one of the things, just like airline regulation, that we depend on for both business and our personal lives.
Thank you, Senator.
Assemblymember Blumenfield.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on your comment and apologize. I missed part of this hearing, although we covered a lot of this in our subcommittee oversight hearing. But when you're talking about bridge inspections, one of the things that's maddening to me is that inspectors are furloughed and they're federally paid, not paid by the state. So I sort of throw out the rhetorical question again, which is, would we have more and a more effective inspection program if we didn't furlough inspectors who were not even on the state payroll to begin with?
as I said before, the minute we went into the furlough program, there was a clause in the executive order that allowed us to get an exemption to the standard furlough program, and I applied for that for the field inspection process, which we got. And so what they're doing is they're accruing furlough days, but they're working 5 days a week. And then when Barton, who I've known for many, many years, he said, hey, we're getting behind on the paperwork as well. And so we applied for another exemption. And so those folks that write the paper, do the reports in the office, they're not furloughed on the standard furlough either. And so they're accruing furlough days. And so we're doing everything we can to keep this bridge inspection program on track.
There wasn't a comment sort of directed to the way you're handling, because you're doing exactly the right thing in terms of how we deal with those. It's just sort of the maddening policy that you have to go through all these hoops to try to get the inspectors that you need when, in my mind, we should never be furloughing folks that are not on the state payroll.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Mr. Director, anything else that you'd like to share with us? I think this has been a very informative committee. I hope that, I think there was a great give and take between members, Caltrans, and this joint committee. I think there are a number of questions that were raised, issues. I think that I want to follow up on what Senator Hancock said, is that this just leads us into other issues about that around oversight, and that it's really important, especially, and I keep getting back to the idea that this was a bridge that 20 years ago was degraded, and so we are living under borrowed time, long before you became involved in this issue, and this one event occurred. But a disaster could happen at any time now. And, as you pointed out in your talk, we were very fortunate that that 6.5 earthquake occurred out at sea and quite far north, because if that occurred anywhere near the Bay Area, we're talking about a major catastrophe on the Bay Bridge, because it's already a degraded bridge at this moment.
Well, Chairman, thank you for inviting us to hear our side of the story, so to speak. I think we were able to talk about our inspection program. I'm very proud of the bridge inspection program and the people that do it on a daily basis. They, as you say, they're not seen. They do it at night. We do it on snoopers, but we're looking at every bridge on a schedule and trying to keep up with that schedule. So thank you for allowing us to come here in Barton to kind of talk about the inspection program. The other thing is, and we will get lessons learned. I mean, we are learning on a daily basis. This is not something that if we did that again, you won't have to call me back. I won't come. We're not going to make those same mistakes. We do try to do continuous improvement. We're trying to do that on our outreach. I think our outreach is getting better. We're not fail-safe. We are trying to reach the right population. We've notified the California Trucking Association to put on their website, trucks, please slow down, because they're not always aware of the changing conditions. So we're trying to get better at outreach. I think Doyle Drive is a good example of a success story there. We've closed the ramp, and it was smooth, I think was the words that San Francisco Chronicle used. And I also want to thank the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in BATA, and then the California Transportation Commission, who's a partner with us on trying to get the toll bridge program completed. Without them, it's very difficult to work not only the funding, but just the outreach. We're more effective the more diverse we get, and we can get into the right people and talk about the program and where we are. So I appreciate that. And it's been a pleasure to work with you, I mean, and your laws and the regulations and holding us accountable for the things that we should be doing. So thank you for that, and I'm ready to go.
Well, I just want to follow up and say one last thing to follow up what Senator Hancock said and Assemblymember Blumenfield said. While we agree with you and we support and we think that you are out there day by day inspecting bridges, you're not inspecting every bridge all the time, at the time, that really probably needs to be inspected. You already talked about, all those I-bar bridges that we have in the state that, required to have every 2 years. You try to do it at least every once a year, probably maybe even more frequently if you had the resources. And whether it's the furloughs or others, we should be making sure that the public safety is of paramount importance and that we are providing the resources and that Caltrans is not put under in any way place the residents of this state at risk. And so I thank you for what you're doing, but some of these issues are far beyond just what you're doing, and they're the responsibility of the legislature to raise these issues and ask you about whether you have the resources and tools to do the inspections that are needed to be done, not just one bridge, but other bridges that have the same design and other bridges in the state. We never even touched on all the types of bridge inspections that need to be done. So are there other members that wish to say something? With that, I would like to thank you again and to thank all the other, both the Assembly members that came today and the Assembly Transportation, the Senate Subcommittee on Budget Subcommittee 2, and the Senate Select Committee on Bay Area Transportation. And this hearing is adjourned.